Every night I think about that before I sleep, that at the time that I have arrived to Greece, if I would have access to what European Lawyers in Lesvos is doing, I would have win actually 1 year of my life. I lost 1 year not having documents and being scared of getting out from the camp. I did not have access to the legal aid.
Moria, spring 2024. I have returned once again to Lesvos, where the most notorious camp for refugees and migrants in the EU was located. Today, on this beautiful early summer day, there's little left to see. Moria burned down in 2020. The ruins have become overgrown. But as I walk there, I still see traces of the Great Fire. Charred wooden beams here, a burned shoe there. People are still arriving in Lesvos in 2024 at one of the EU's external borders. I want to see if they get what is essentially the leitmotif of this podcast, access to justice. I want to capture what that really means, to kind of measure access to justice against reality. I visited Lesvos and Athens. I spoke with many people who gave me great insights, including Salman, the translator who fled to Europe with his family and now works for the European Lawyers in Lesvos. This organization provides first aid legal advice. Disclaimer, I was active with the European Lawyers when they were founded in 2016. We heard from Salman at the beginning of this episode. I also speak with Ramin, not his real name, but the one I will use. Ramin came to Europe from Afghanistan and now lives in Camp Mavrovuni, set up as a transition camp after the destruction of Moria.
I passed by the container was belong to the UNHCR, and I saw the Lesvos lawyer were there, and I hear that they can support and help in a humanity way. And I understand it's something inside me said, okay, they are a right person.
I also went to the Mavrovuni camp and spoke with people who work there. These conversations provided the background information I needed to better understand the current situation. In this 96th episode of the Rechtsgespräch-Podcast, I also talked to some of the European lawyers, a representative from the United Nations Refugee Agency in Lesvos, with experts on asylum and migration law from academia and legal practice, and a member of the conservative EPP group in the European Parliament. And I traveled to Poland in June 2024. In Warsaw and Bialystok, I spoke with lawyers whose lives were impacted by the so-called refugee crisis at the EU's eastern border. And I went right to the Belarus border, meeting volunteers who support refugees and migrants. I also had conversations with many other people who gave me background information but often did not want to be named or quoted. I am Kurt Brugmann, a lawyer and historian, and this episode is a special edition on access to justice and the EU's external borders. I remember when I arrived at the camp gate in March 2016, it was my second or third visit, and I was still unsure if it was possible to establish something like a legal aid project. When I arrived, a friend excitedly told me that just a few minutes earlier, a Syrian woman had stood on a container, desperate, shouting, "They don't give us access to a lawyer." This made me realize in 2016 just how significant legal advice from lawyers is. Another memory. As I am walking back from Moria along the coastal road towards Camp Mavrovuni, I recall the story of the Iraqi man whose asylum application had just been rejected. He told a lawyer from the European Lawyers that he had done everything he could to make it clear to the officials that he was a hard-working, good truck driver and that he was willing to take any job. He also said that he would of course help the economy in the host country. What he hadn't mentioned, and it came out later only when the case was denied, was that he was a member of a persecuted religious minority. He had fled after part of his family had been murdered. Why hadn't he said this? He was ashamed to admit this weakness and didn't know that his persecution story would have granted him secure protection status in the EU. With legal advice, he would have told his story, of course. Well, I said I wanted to find out how access to justice works at the EU's external borders. To me, access to justice means having rights, knowing that you have these rights, and the ability to enforce these rights within a system of administration of justice which adheres to the rule of law. So let's see if we can find access to justice at the EU's external borders. After all, the EU calls itself a space of freedom, security, and justice. What does it mean to have rights? I thought Pauline Endres de Oliveira, a professor of migration law at Humboldt University in Berlin, could tell me. I asked her what rights people who knock on the EU's door at its external borders, which rights they can invoke. Is there a right to access to justice?
Ja, also Menschen, die hier bei uns an der EU ankommen, können sich erstmal auf das Recht berufen.
Professor Endres de Oliveira says, yes, people arriving at the EU can invoke the right not to be sent back to a country where they face persecution. This non-refoulement principle is the core principle in refugee law. They also have the right to a fair asylum procedure. These rights bind the EU and the individual member states. I also asked her where these rights come from. She says,
Also im Migrationsrecht ist es
in migration law, as in many other areas of law, it's crucial to recognize that we have three levels of law: international law, European law, EU law, and national law. These levels are interconnected. Pauline Endres de Oliveira makes clear that the most important international law in refugee protection is the 1951 Geneva Refugee Convention. This convention established the right to non-refoulement, and it defines who is considered a refugee. Pauline Endres de Oliveira also mentions the European Convention on Human Rights, a legal document which applies to basically all countries on the European continent, and which establishes fundamental rights and freedoms that partly overlap with those rights of the Geneva Refugee Convention in their scope, and they complement each other. She stresses how important it is to keep in mind that international law impacts domestic law.
Die beeinflussen auch das nationale Recht.
In this episode of the Rechtsgespräch-Podcast, we are specifically discussing access to justice at the EU's external borders. As lawyers, we often deal with clear-cut borders, but also with gray areas. And it's true that access to justice isn't really an access in the sense of a door or a gate, but it can maybe better be described as a path on which not every step is totally clear. That's why I wanted to know from Pauline Endres de Oliveira if it makes a difference when someone seeking protection stands directly in front of the EU border, on the border fence, or behind the fence in the EU.
Auf normativer Ebene ist geklärt, dass
Pauline Endres de Oliveira explains that legally it's clear that people arriving at or on the EU border can invoke rights from the Geneva Refugee Convention and the European Convention on Human Rights. But there are legal disputes in extraterritorial contexts. She says, it is clear, though, that the European Convention on Human Rights non-refoulement principle is applicable to situations on the high sea. For example, when people are intercepted and held on ships that are flying a European flag. And what if someone reaches the EU external border?
Also das Recht, wenn eine Person an der Grenze der EU ankommt.
In that case, it should be clear too. When a person arrives at the EU border, they typically encounter border guards. This contact establishes a relationship in which the border guards exercise state authority. They are bound by national and international law, and the individual arriving has rights like the right to non-refoulement. This means that border officials cannot simply send someone back to danger. I recall, however, that this no longer applies without exception, that the European Court of Human Rights has also kind of softened what I would call a clear-cut definition. Pauline Endres de Oliveira can help me refresh my memory.
Bei der Frage, inwiefern das anerkannt ist, dass diese grundlegenden Menschen- und Flüchtlingsrechte...
Although it is recognized, she says that the right to non-refoulement applies already at the borders, there is a significant and far-reaching decision which comes from the European Court of Human Rights, the case of ND and NT versus Spain. This case involved the collective expulsion of people trying to cross the fences at Spain's enclaves in Morocco. People tried to cross the fences there, and border guards pushed them back to Morocco, where Moroccan border guards apprehended them and took them away. Pauline Endres de Oliveira explains how, in the end, the Grand Chamber of the European Court of Human Rights in 2020, although it acknowledged the European Convention on Human Rights applicability, stated that these individuals could not claim the right against collective expulsion due to their illegal storming of the fences, bypassing legal entry options. Pauline Endres de Oliveira says this ruling is problematic because it contradicts the fundamental idea that human rights apply universally, irrespective of behavior. The ruling also refers to access to justice routes which in reality don't exist or are unavailable. Having rights always means having the right to access to the proceedings. This assumes that a person is recognized as a legal subject. What happens, though, when people are treated as objects? You can observe this since 2021 at the eastern EU border between Poland and Belarus. I traveled there a few weeks ago in mid-June. On a midsummer's day, I reach a small hamlet not far from the border with Belarus. There's a house where volunteers are preparing missions to help arriving migrants. Just as I arrive, they have received a message from a family via the emergency number that people on the run somehow have, with an indication where they are in the forest near the border. The volunteers now have prepared dry and clean clothes for 2 adults and some children and are about to take them in backpacks to the location where the family, probably from Ethiopia, is waiting. They are also preparing powers of attorney in Amharic. These powers of attorney are the basis for giving people access to the procedure that can give them refugee protection after crossing the border. Without these documents, there's a high risk the Polish border troops will immediately send them back to Belarus, which could mean they might be thrown over the fence. Now the backpacks are packed. The volunteers have also collected thermoses with soup, water bottles, and protective sheets against hypothermia. Their mission now gives me time to go to the border myself to get an actual impression. I can't walk right to the fence. A 200-meter wide security zone, a no-go zone, was set up there a few days ago. As I'm approaching it in the forest, I receive this text message. Warning. Ban on staying in the Polish area near the Belarus border. Unauthorized crossing is forbidden. Soldiers may use weapons. Turn back immediately. This text message is also received by refugees and migrants. A few hours later, the volunteers are returning, tired but happy because everything went well, and the border guards were reasonable and even friendly when it came to this Ethiopian family's application for international protection. Now, Tomasz Tun-Janowski, one of the volunteers, has time for a conversation. He is a cultural manager who has been involved in humanitarian aid for almost 3 years.
So we are operating only on the Polish soil, on the Polish side of the border, and providing the basic humanitarian assistance, providing people with food, clothes, some basic legal help.
I ask him how his group works.
People on the move are calling us most often with the information on where they are, how many of them need assistance, what kind of assistance, whether they have some medical problems we can help them with. thanks to the Médecins Sans Frontières, who is having here their shifts. We, in cases, more severe cases of medical help needed, we also going to the woods, to the forest with them to provide them the basic help on the spot. But of course, we are trained for the pre-medical help, all of us, because very often we are dealing with less or more serious injuries because people are, first of all, jumping through the fence, which is 5 meters high, so it's big height, and people are injuring themselves, their legs, they are twisting or broken legs or hands. So very often we need to take care of them on the spot.
In total, almost 150,000 people have tried to get from Belarus to Poland since 2021. Most of them were lured to Belarus by the government of dictator Lukashenko and transported to the border with Poland, which stretches through a vast wilderness. This has been an ongoing attempt by Putin's ally Lukashenko to destabilize the EU, Tomasz explains.
Altogether, from the very beginning of the crisis, so it's August 2021, we received more or less 20-something thousand calls for assistance.
Is there access to justice on the Polish-Belarusian border? Only for those who aren't pushed back. Thousands of such pushbacks have been reported by human rights organizations. The Polish government, according to media reports, mentioned themselves more than 6,000 pushbacks only between July 2023 and January 2024.
All lawyers and court sentences and all analytic papers done by lawyers, by international and local legal organizations is saying that pushbacks are illegal. Full stop. It's against the Polish constitution, it's against the international law and Geneva Convention and other international documents. I'm very surprised and disappointed by the information from the last week that in almost 1/3 of the cases our presence was not honored by the border guards and the persons who applied for our protection was pushed back.
Kasia also reports on pushbacks. Kasia lives with her husband and child in the small town of Hajnówka, a few kilometers away from the Belarusian border.
Pushbacks are present when nobody is watching in the forest. Polish border guards catch people and throw them back to Belarus. Even if people are injured or in not state of their health, or they are women or children, people are pushed back to Belarus.
Kasia lives very close to the local hospital. From her living room, she observed how people with quite severe injuries and frostbite were brought to this local hospital and in some cases ended up on the street after being treated. We drove together to the container on the hospital grounds belonging to EGALA, the organization where she works now, and she showed me what she and her colleagues do. Later, we are having another conversation during an extended walk through the fields near Hajnówka.
So we are a group of people who provide support, help for people in the hospital, in the forest, and people in the procedure for international protection. I'm the coordinator of a case working group. Every day I have access to people who are hospitalized in our town, in our hospital. Many times they are found in critical states. They are many times unconscious. They are very exhausted physically, mentally. They are hungry. They are many times injured because they cross the border by jumping through the wall. They break bones. They break legs, back, arms. Sometimes they cross the border by the river, so they are all wet. Their belongings are not existing anymore. They are in very bad position.
I also asked Kasia about her motivation, as she had told me that she had even given up her job to engage in humanitarian work.
It is important for us to keep the standards of human rights, that everybody should have clothes, everybody should not be hungry or thirsty, and should have the access to hospital data, to know about the health condition. So we provide them this kind of information so that they feel good in our country, because they deserve it.
Kasia says, pushbacks are present when nobody is watching. So having rights also means being recognized in your existence, being visible as an individual. This is kind of self-evident for us, but not for everyone, especially not for those who are literally in the dark. In Belarus and Poland, for example, this is the Białowieża Forest, where people are often pushed back and forth from one country that doesn't want them to the next and back again. But now, let's go back to Lesvos. There, Salman, whom we heard in the introduction of the episode, tells me about his invisibility.
I'm from a stateless family. We didn't have any rights, so we could not go to school, we could not have access to anything. I arrived in 2016 and I left from there around 2017. I left in an illegal way. I had to go and find an accommodation in the mainland, which was Athens. And I finally managed to enter a camp, which they call it Sigara Magaz camp. I entered there in an illegal way too, because I did not have documents. So I stayed there for approximately 1 year undocumented and not being able to even get out from the camp during that time.
I often encounter this phrase in my conversations, that having rights or a legal existence cannot be taken for granted. The Afghan refugee Ramin puts it this way.
When you enter to the new countries, new territories, it's a look like some newborn baby. It's very difficult. The newborn baby doesn't know how to walk, doesn't know how to eat, doesn't know how to talk. We had the same example. Now we are in a new country. And the point is, when you enter to the new place, new country, you have to feel that the parents are there. And sometimes it's not possible to happen, but right now in this society, in this place, we felt that we accepted by the society and the Elil organization.
In Lesvos, I also visited Tulina Demeli at the office of the United Nations Refugee Agency, UNHCR. Tulina is a lawyer herself and works at UNHCR as a protection officer. She says,
actually, if you ask them, I think their main worry is that they receive status. Some people had never had the status in their lives. They were always persecuted and didn't have documents. So it's absolutely necessary for them, for their existence, to benefit from legal aid and be granted with status.
Now we have shed light on what it means to have rights. When we look through the eyes of those seeking access to justice, I'm wondering, how is it with their knowledge about their rights when they arrive at the EU's external borders? After my conversations in Greece and Poland, I think I can summarize like this. People who have reached the EU's external borders as refugees and migrants have little knowledge of the legal procedures that they will face. And the information they do have is largely misinformation and rumors. Those rumors mainly come from social media. That's why legal advice is so important, especially at the beginning of a procedure. I discussed this topic with Rose Carey, a London-based partner at the international law firm Charles Russell Speechlys. She was a volunteer with the European Lawyers in Lesvos in 2019 as part of the Greece Pro Bono Collaborative. This is an association of 6 commercial law firms that have been cooperating with the European lawyers since 2019. More on this later. Rose told me,
it's very important that they understand the type of questions that they will be asked in the interview and what the purpose of that interview is with the Greek Asylum Service. Many asylum seekers are quite traumatized by their experiences, and they don't understand how important it is to explain what has happened to them and what has led them to flee their home and seek asylum somewhere. And often, they want to put their best foot forward and talk about, their academic qualifications, their experience, and sort of show how they can really contribute towards society, when in fact, actually, that's not relevant to the asylum claim. And what's more important is talking about all these terrible things that they've experienced and the problems that they had. They really don't understand that. So many asylum seekers will not talk about those things during the asylum interview. And that's often the reason why, unfortunately, their asylum claim is refused. So in these interviews, we are explaining to them, this is how the process works. You have to, talk about these issues and these problems that you've experienced and explain, why you're having to seek asylum. And because of that, they attend the interviews, and then they're able to understand the purpose of the interview, and they're able to then give the information to the interviewer.
And what kind of information do people actually get from the institutions? What is it like in Lesvos? I talked to UNHCR's Tulina Demeli also about that topic.
UNHCR's response and support to the government changed along the years in accordance with the needs. But in general, we can say that we were always, and we are still, providing information to new arrivals on their basic rights, obligations, on the basic steps of the procedures that will follow, reception, identification procedures, the asylum procedure, and other important things that they need to know.
But of course, other things besides legal advice are very important at the very beginning.
Of course, people need to eat, to have dignified reception conditions, shelter, and receive medical assistance, etc.
And yet?
The situation is not so simple. It's more complicated. First of all, legal counseling and assistance is needed prior to the registration in the context of the reception and identification procedures, because they're also very important in determining sometimes the course of the asylum procedure. They need to be prepared for the asylum interview and be represented by a lawyer in the asylum interview. It's not obligatory, but it's absolutely important that a lawyer assists them and escorts them to the asylum interview.
I wanted to know more in detail from Tulina what the reality looks like after arrival.
So, people receive information upon arrival. They're apprehended by the police or the Coast Guard, usually by the Coast Guard, then they're transferred to the CCSC. There, they receive information by the Reception and Identification Service on basic procedures, rights, obligations, and the services available in the site. And so, yes, just to note that at this stage, we try to focus on the most important issues that they need to know on the first steps of the procedure, because it is a rather complicated procedure, and these people have been through a very difficult and dangerous journey. Some of them were hiding in the bushes until they were apprehended by the authorities. It is difficult for them to comprehend complicated legal information. So we provide the basic things that they need to know, and we invite them to come and meet us at the UNHCR Protection and Integration Desk, which operates inside the CCC.
Tulina Demeli already mentioned here that the people who arrive in Lesvos have often made great efforts. They have undergone great hardships. This reminds me of what I have seen repeatedly over the years when I was in Lesvos more often. One particularly vivid memory is of the arrival of a rubber boat. It was probably in March or April 2016, at dawn, near the airport of Mytilene, when the sea wasn't really calm. A boat had just arrived. It was completely overcrowded. I remember a family with small children. The moment the parents and children had solid ground under their feet, the father collapsed. What a burden must have fallen from his shoulders upon arriving in Europe. I also remember the overcrowded UNHCR buses that took the new arrivals to Camp Moria. I remember the chaos at the registration and the unbearable conditions in Moria. I want to understand how reality has changed since Moria no longer exists.
The situation, first of all, improved significantly comparing to the situation we had in Moria, where it was quite challenging. We reached more than 20,000 people outside the official structures. There was the so-called jungle with tents everywhere. You have been there, you've seen it, you know it. It was absolutely difficult to monitor the situation for people who were in need of protection to have access to appropriate services. There were important backlogs in the asylum procedure, which would last for years. It was a very difficult situation. So after Moria was burned down, it was supposed to be temporary site, started operating here in Mavrovouni, which took a lot of efforts from the government, from UNHCR, from the actors operating in Lesvos to set it up in an effective manner. I think lots of progress was done, but of course there is still room for improvement. For example, when arrivals increased now and peaked in September, and we had 6,000 people over the site's capacity, the shelter condition was quite challenging. Access to services was also more difficult because more people would be in need for the same services provided by the same actors and staff. So it has improved significantly since Moria.
We have seen how important it is that people have rights and that they are aware of them. Information and advice are essential. But these rights only help if there's a way to enforce them. I think this comes down to two things. First, whether there are fair procedures in which people arriving at the EU's external borders are treated as the law requires. This means that those entitled to protection should receive it straightforwardly without further ado. After all, it's a principle of the rule of law that people, especially those who are vulnerable, should not have to fight for their individual rights. So this first point is aimed at a lawful system of administration. The second aspect is that those who believe their claim is wrongly denied have legal remedies against negative decisions. But first, let's look at lawful administrative procedures. When I was in Lesvos, from 2016 onward, I saw that such procedures were not in place. I always thought this was not Greece's problem, but a failure of the EU. And I'm sure that every democratic politician thinks the same about the situation back then. This includes Lena Dupont from the European People's Party group in the European Parliament. In the last legislature, she was a member of the Committee on Civil Liberties, Justice and Home Affairs, and also spokesperson for her group in this committee. Lena Dupont helped negotiate the current EU Asylum and Migration Pact. I reached her in Brussels in early July. Lena Dupont tells us that she has been to Lesvos herself, where she saw not only a makeshift stopgap solution to good administrative proceedings in its worst form, but, as she calls it, complete human misery and chaos in which people were left. She adds that it was precisely these images she had in mind during the negotiations, where she and the other negotiating parties said that, being the European Union, they must set up procedures, including providing access to advice, information and support. The core of the administrative procedure, which many arriving migrants and refugees do not even know is a procedure guided by the law, is the initial hearing of the person seeking protection. Rose Carey from the Greece Pro Bono Collaborative has already said what misconceptions people have about this. And that certainly became clear also in the story of the Iraqi man I told at the beginning. Rose Carey, who today prepares colleagues in her law firm for a voluntary secondment with the European lawyers, says,
I think the success rate for people who do not have ILIL support is around 31%. But those that have worked with ILIL and had ILIL support, the success rate is 70%. So you can just see with those figures the difference that ILIL makes.
When I spoke with lawyers in Greece and Poland, I was also interested in what reality looks like if someone receives a negative administrative decision. Is there effective legal protection against it? First of all, the lawyers of the European lawyers in Lesvos cannot in principle speak from their own experience because their mandate is limited to providing initial advice at the beginning of the administrative proceedings. Phil Worthington, director of the European lawyers.
Basically what that means is that we help people obviously prepare for their asylum interview. That's probably 80% of what we do. We support people with family reunification. We support people who have been detained upon arrival, so in detention centres in Greece. We support unaccompanied children, particularly with issues of age assessment. And we help people with the administrative legal procedure, getting themselves registered, navigating the procedure so that they know their rights, they attend the interview when they're supposed to, they don't get lost in the procedure. To do that, we focus primarily on one-on-one legal consultations in the kind of the traditional model as if it was in a law firm. So we'll have confidential consultations between the individual and the lawyer with the support of a professional interpreter. For the vast majority of cases, we'll also write supporting legal memos, legal submissions, and for as many cases as we can, we'll represent them at the interview as well. Obviously, we can't do that for every case, but for vulnerable individuals or people with particular needs, we'll represent them at interview as well. However, at the point at which somebody gets their decision, that's the point at which our mandate finishes. So we don't do any appeals, we don't do strategic litigation, we don't do court proceedings beyond first instance.
This applies to Poland as well. In Poland, I asked Jakub Wawniczak, a lawyer whom I visited at his office in Białystok. Bialystok is the capital of Podlakia, the province where most people cross the Belarusian border into the EU.
I think the current situation the studies, the trainees for the attorneys didn't prepare us for this crisis. So we all, everyone, and I'm talking everyone, judges, attorneys at law, we took pretty much a fast course of migrant law, of asylum law, right? Some of us are experts right now. Yeah, but my field of expertise is administrative and public law.
I asked Jakub how he became involved in his work. He is now full-time and exclusively working as a migration and asylum lawyer. He's also working for the European lawyers, who have been in Poland since 2022.
Well, I provide the legal assistance to the local communities which are located next to the border. So I saw the crisis firsthand back in 2020, end of 2020, beginning of 2021. I saw it before it was televised, so to say. Yeah, and I started to understand that the system doesn't really work, and me as an attorney at law, I am needed there. I have to do my work because that is what is the principle of our jobs, right? To safeguard the certain laws and security, right?
And regarding the scope of the mandate of the European lawyers, he says,
well, we provide legal assistance, we provide legal representation, but we do this up until the ending of the first instance proceedings.
So again, what about legal remedies? If I summarize the content of the many conversations I've had, I would say it's really difficult, mainly because there are simply too few asylum and migration lawyers, because the system of financial support for their representation in the asylum procedure at the EU's external borders is not regulated in a satisfactory manner at all, and because the EU has indirectly passed on part of the responsibility for legal protection to NGOs, but they can only partially meet the legal needs. There remain unmet legal needs that have not been really measured, but as everybody I spoke to confirmed, they are very substantial. The EU calls itself, as I mentioned, an area of freedom, security, and justice. By looking at how migrants and refugees are treated at the EU's external borders, we can see how the EU lives up to this promise. Access to justice exists when, as we have seen, people have rights, know they have these rights, and have the ability to enforce them. For this, a system of administration of justice is required. What do I mean by that? In short, in our context, it shouldn't depend on the seeker's financial means, whether they receive legal advice and representation before authorities and courts. And there must be institutions of justice that meet standards of the rule of law. I assume all democratic politicians want this and don't sacrifice access to justice at the EU's external borders for the sake of deterrence. Lena Dupont comments on this. In the end, this will not work without significant support from the European Union, both financially and structurally, to ensure that access to justice can actually be guaranteed on the ground. She reminds us that she emphasized this in the European Parliament during negotiations already. She notes that the Parliament will work very closely with the member states on the implementation of the pact. They will keep a close watch on it and exercise parliamentary oversight. Lena Dupont concludes that it is of no use if law is only in the books and not applied in practice. NGOs are important for access to justice. We have also seen this in the example of the European Lawyers in Lesvos. However, they cannot replace a system of access to justice that the state must provide when it comes to administration and justice. And the state must provide the infrastructure for advice and representation. This is also the view of Peter Braun. Peter Braun is one of those who work in civil society for access to justice and whose law firm, the global commercial law firm Dentons, where he is a partner, has accompanied the transformation of the European lawyers from an ad hoc initiative to a stable NGO. Today, Dentons is part of the Greece Pro Bono Collaborative, which includes the law firm of Rose Carey, who spoke earlier about the importance of legal advice at the first stage of the administrative process. In addition to those law firms mentioned, the Greece Pro Bono Collaborative consists of Allen & Overy Sherman, Ashurst, Orrick, and White & Case. There's a similar coalition in Poland. The Greece Pro Bono Collaborative was founded to work closely with the European lawyers. Peter Braun? At the end, it is a human right that the rights of people arriving at the EU's external borders are upheld and respected. He emphasizes what an important role in safeguarding these human rights the volunteer lawyers play. The situation at the EU's external borders has not really eased. This is also shown by the statistics from UNHCR. You can see that 2023 was the year with the highest number of newly arriving refugees and migrants after 2015-16. And while it is commendable that the German Bar Association, the European Umbrella Organization of Bar Associations and Law Societies, CCBE, and the French Conseil National du Barreau have supported the European lawyers as stakeholders, to this day, we must acknowledge, as Peter Braun says, it is actually very regrettable that the European Lawyer in Lesvos project has had to become as permanent as it has. Now, one must admit that migration and asylum policies are really a challenge nowadays. And it will continue to be a challenge because migration has been and is a global constant. This report from Lesvos, Athens, Warsaw, and northeastern Poland cannot address all the challenges related to migration. It is limited to access to justice. Incidentally, an example of how access to justice can be designed to be legally compliant, even with relatively fast procedures and under detention conditions, exists in Germany. I am referring to the so-called airport procedure introduced with the major asylum law amendment in 1993. It is a procedure in the transit area of international airports for people who do not have a valid identity documents or who come from a safe country of origin. The Federal Constitutional Court in Germany ruled on the structure of this procedure in 1996. I wanted to find out the details from someone who is familiar with it. So I spoke with Stefan Hox, a lawyer in Frankfurt, who represents clients in the airport procedure and who chairs the Migration Law Committee of the German Federal Bar. First, I asked him to describe the situation at Frankfurt Airport.
Also dieses Transitgelände im Frankfurter Flughafen ist immens groß. Also
the transit area in Frankfurt Airport is really large. Anyone who has traveled there knows that you can stay there for days if you want. You can stay there as long as you don't proceed to the border control. But eventually you'll either be approached by the police or you approach the border control and apply for asylum and entry to Germany. Stefan Hox explains what the procedure looks like from there. The border authority checks whether the person is from a safe country of origin or does not have a passport. If the person has a passport, entry is to be granted for the purpose of applying for asylum. This is part of the Geneva Convention and other international regulations. But those, he explains, who cannot present a passport go through the airport procedure. They are not allowed entry because at that point legally they have not entered German territory. Now, these individuals' concerns are recorded. An interview takes place in one of the buildings where personal details are taken, and the police inquire about travel routes and reasons for seeking asylum. Stefan Hox calls this a mini-asylum hearing, which determines whether the individual falls under the airport asylum procedure. Again, without a passport, people will be taken to Cargo City South, which houses freight agencies and offices of the Federal Office for Migration, which includes a detention facility. The asylum procedure at the airport continues with the Federal Office having two options. They can either find merit in the asylum application, releasing the person from the transit detention facility to a reception center in Germany. Alternatively, if the Federal Office considers the application offensichtlich unbegründet, which means manifestly unfounded, indicating no plausible asylum claim, but possibly economic or personal reasons for the wish to enter the EU, then entry is denied, and the person remains in transit to be returned to their place of origin or nationality. This happens after an interview, about 2 days after arrival. Stefan Hox says that at that stage there is a very short period of legal action, just 3 days. An emergency application can be filed alongside a lawsuit against the Federal Office's decision, a lawsuit to overturn that decision and grant refugee protection. Stefan Hox reports that in the airport proceedings, the first hearing already takes place with greater care to avoid negative publicity.
Das kann man auch sehen.
Hearing transcripts usually are 7 to 8 pages long, but here they are always around 20 pages. He explains that the authorities want to conduct these proceedings very precisely because they are kind of in the public eye.
Dass es immer auch im Fokus der Öffentlichkeit steht.
As mentioned, the Federal Constitutional Court ruled in 1996 that people in these proceedings have a right to asylum-competent legal advice. This right has been realized in Frankfurt since then by the local Frankfurt Bar Association, which has organized a 24/7 duty service with asylum-competent lawyers since the late 1990s, modestly funded by the Federal Office for Migration and Refugees.
Die Anwältinnen und Anwälte tun das im Wesentlichen aus dem Gefühl heraus, sie sind halt hier die Bastion des Rechtsschutzes sozusagen.
The lawyers essentially do this out of a sense of duty, being the strongholds of legal protection. However, he immediately qualifies in our conversation. Prior to the interview or hearing, there is no right to free legal advice. Of course, individuals can at an early stage hire a lawyer who will then have access to the building complex. Additionally, the Protestant and Catholic churches provide advice. They jointly run a legal advice office at Frankfurt Airport, staffed with multilingual personnel. They can advise new arrivals. In some cases, if Caritas or Diakonie identify a significant case, they may fund legal advice and representation by lawyers before the hearing. Is the airport procedure perfect? Of course not. It would be better if there were asylum-competent advice already in preparation for the first hearing in the administrative procedure. But this is not mandatory. Stefan Hox suspects that such a mandatory advice would not be in the interest of the authorities.
das ist die Situation, dass die Person...
The reality is that individuals are isolated, without contact with a lawyer and forced to present their asylum case quickly. The authorities prefer to hear asylum claims directly, unfiltered by prior advice. There is a suspicion that lawyers and NGOs might give tactical advice, which is not true to the facts in that very case. Of course, lawyers and NGOs don't do this. Stefan Hocks stresses how important it is that someone has discussed their claim beforehand, considering the plausibility and details necessary for the hearing. Many refugees and migrants don't understand the process at all without advice. Nevertheless, the airport procedure could perhaps be described as a system that shows what minimum standards would also be needed at the EU's external borders in order for them to comply with constitutional and European law. Pauline Endres de Oliveira, the professor from Humboldt University Berlin, describes it to me like this.
So ein System der flächendeckenden Rechtsberatung ist auch für die Staaten sinnvoll. Denn
Such a system of comprehensive legal advice could also be beneficial for the authorities because informed people approach the procedure differently. Not every person is in need of protection, but those who are in need of protection are particularly dependent on access to legal advice. There are many examples where this works well and shows how important it is. For example, in the German airport procedure, professional legal assistance is provided, similar to mandatory defense counsel in some criminal cases. This is important not only for individuals, but also for the authorities involved, who can assess the case very differently. I would say, Pauline Endres de Oliveira says, that the airport procedures in Germany are a very good and important example of how in fast-track processing mandatory legal assistance exists and works. Here, in the airport proceedings, it was taken into account that people cannot access legal assistance. In her view, this kind of legal advice is the minimum that must be provided. A short procedure can be beneficial even for the migrants and refugees, as long as the situation still allows for the individual examination of the case. Quick procedures always involve quick reviews and quick decisions, and therefore carry the risk of not being able to capture all factual constellations in detail. Therefore, legal protection and legal assistance are even more important. Unfortunately, in the European discussions on the EU Migration Pact, these mandatory standards were not equally taken into account.
Ich sehe leider, dass in den europäischen Diskussionen zu ähnlichen Verfahrensarten, zu schnellen Verfahren an Grenzen, diese verpflichtenden Standards nicht gleichermaßen mit berücksichtigt, mit bedacht werden.
We've heard it multiple times now. Legal advice and representation are indispensable for access to justice. We have also heard that there are not enough lawyers at the EU's external borders. This makes those who work under the umbrella of NGOs, whether employed or as volunteers, even more important. I have already talked about the European lawyers in Lesvos in several episodes of this podcast. What I find impressive is how the European lawyers have managed to be anchored locally, where they give legal advice. This builds trust in the local legal community. And during my visits and conversations, I saw for myself how well asylum lawyers, who are mostly solo practitioners, and lawyers from large commercial law firms work together. Phil Worthington, director of the European Lawyers, describes it like this.
The expert asylum lawyers who so far we've had people from 19 different European countries who come and volunteer with us. We also have collaborative projects with big international law firms. In those situations, it's lawyers from these firms who are obviously not specialised asylum lawyers will come on secondment to Lille to support with our work in those two locations.
I ask Phil what tasks the various volunteers do.
The work that these volunteers can do is, it depends a bit on the volunteers. So the volunteer asylum lawyers, they will give advice because they're experts and they're bar association members. They're supervised by our local lawyers, but they are qualified to provide legal advice. The legal assistants and the lawyers from the secondees from the law firms. Their role is to support because they don't have the expertise necessarily to give the advice, so they work with the Greek asylum lawyers to work on the case together. So that will involve them being in the preparation to support the Greek asylum lawyer, to identify issues for further research, which they'll then do the research. They help with writing the memos, the written submissions, because again, obviously they have lots of expertise in writing legal memos or legal submissions. And the other thing that the volunteers can do, which is slightly more nebulous, is act as what we call the critical friend. So that's somebody who is a lawyer, is legally trained, is listening to a case in the same way that maybe the person who will actually conduct the first instance interview from the state apparatus will hear it for the first time. Similarly, the volunteer, the secondee, will listen to it for the first time, and it's that kind of instinctive, where are the gaps? Where are the things that I'm feeling not quite sure about? Where are the things that don't quite add up? That critical friend role is absolutely crucial, because they will see the same things that people in the asylum service may see, and we can talk about it and discuss it and kind of get people in a position to present their case in the best possible way.
Phil himself is still positively surprised at how well the lawyers who come from different legal cultures work together.
So the collaboration between these two quite opposite ends of the spectrum of the profession of volunteer asylum lawyers who, often, like say, work as sole practitioners or maybe as part of a small firm, with people who are working in law firms that could be, thousands or tens of thousands of lawyers. I would say that in the beginning, I didn't know how this was going to work, because I could see that there could be some cultural differences in terms of working styles and environments. I'm delighted, though, that I've been proven completely wrong by that. And actually, this is something that is, I think, a great... it makes me feel proud to be a lawyer. And I think it's a great credit to the legal profession, because the truth is that what unites us as lawyers is far, far more than what divides us, no matter what our practitioner situation is, no matter what our speciality is, no matter what kind of organizational firm we work in. The point being is that ultimately, of the 450 plus volunteers that we've had, hardly anybody has not completely immediately grasped the concepts that we are dealing with here, which are simply rule of law and human rights issues. It is basic access to a lawyer, access to justice. And that's something that every lawyer can understand and sympathize with, whether it's a refugee or whether it's in a commercial environment. It's that somebody going through a legal procedure should have access to an expert lawyer to help them I think is a universal axiom of being a lawyer. So yeah, for me it's been as I said, it really makes me proud to be a lawyer, to see those different elements of the legal profession working together.
This was episode 96 of the Rechtsgespräch-Podcast with Cord Brügmann. In the Rechtsgespräch-Podcast, I have tried to shed light on access to justice. My travels to Greece and Poland remind me that access to justice means having rights, knowing those rights, and being able to enforce those rights in a legal system compliant to constitutional law and the rule of law. The Rechtsgespräch-Podcast is now going on a break. I'm grateful for your feedback and suggestions, as well as your subscriptions. Please let me know what you have enjoyed about the Rechtsgespräch-Podcast so far and what topics you would like to hear about when it returns. A 5-star rating on wherever you listen to the Rechtsgespräch-Podcast would be a lovely sign of appreciation. Thank you very much to you, my guests, more than 220 up to date, and to you, the listeners, whose numbers have grown nicely since the first episodes at the end of 2020 and which still continue to grow. My heartfelt thanks go to Hannah Brügmann, who has always been a very good test listener for each episode, noting inconsistencies and many technical errors in the raw version. This has always given me the opportunity to edit the episodes so that they were good for you to listen to. All the best.